What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, the number one ideological source of theological ingredients on the interwebs. For over 11 years, we've been bringing you some of the best, the brightest, the most intriguing and inspiring minds across the academy, right into your earbuds. And today, we're joined by biologist Kenneth R. Miller. Oh yeah, Ken Miller on the podcast. He has written a whole host of books engaging religion, science, and things. And on top of that, he's written one of the most popular biology textbooks in the U.S. of A. That's right. What does that mean? It means he's been intimately involved in all the battles with creationism, intelligent design, and in the different ways that more conservative fundamentalist Christians have been trying to have their interpretation of Genesis, squeezed into a science classroom. Ken Miller's like, I'm a committed Catholic. I'm a biologist. This is not necessary. And then we get to talking in this episode about a whole host of other issues like free will, human consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness. We end up talking about his own story and the way his faith and life as a scientist has interacted. It's a blast. It's a blast. I know you're going to love it. I can't wait to share it with you. Before we jump in, I want to tell you all about an amazing opportunity this summer. What is it, Trip? I am doing a class this summer with the one and only John D. Caputo. Philosopher extraordinaire, a major interpreter of Jacques Derrida. Jack Caputo, as he likes to be called, JC, as his initials do state, is going to be doing a class called Theology of Culture, Tillich, and in Radical Theology, right? We're going to be doing it this summer. You can sign up for it at johndcaputo.com. johndcaputo.com. D is his middle initial. It's going to be exciting. We're going to talk about Tillich, James Cone, and black theology, right? Then we're going to talk about Mary Daly, the emergence of feminist theology. And then he's got a fourth session prepared on transhumanism and the way our technology is remaking what it means to be human, and how does that impact us in trying to understand culture. So, yeah, if you want to have a God beyond God, God beyond human limits, God beyond patriarchy, God beyond white supremacy, the white Christ. If you want to get a God beyond all that, then join the summer class this June, Theology of Culture class, johndcaputo.com. Do it. And, as part of that, we're giving away a bunch of Jack's books. We're giving away a bunch of Jack's books, already signed, for you to, one, pop them in your library if you don't have them. But I know a lot of Homebrewed Christianity listeners already have all of Jack's books. Well, they're signed and ready to gift all your favorite theology nerds, because you want to know what says love come birthday time, or maybe just arbitrary day to celebrate your friendship. Yeah. If I win, for example, I may give a copy of Jack's book, Hope Against Hope. Maybe I'll give a signed copy of it to my mom. Not because it's Mother's Day, not because it's her birthday or Christmas, but just because every day is a good day to let my mom know I think she's amazing. You could do that for a family member or a friend. Yeah. Well, I'm just saying it's an option. So if you go to Homebrewed Christianity's website, which is at, you guessed it, homebrewedchristianity.com or tripfuller.com with 2 P's, then you can join the giveaway. It'll be exciting. Tell your friends, win some books, and then join the Jack class, johndcaputo.com. Join the class with Jack Caputo this summer. Do your Theology of Culture. Now. I know it's getting close to Easter. So remember, the week of Easter, we have special announcements. I don't know why I just yelled that. Perhaps it's because I had 8 hours sleep last night. I know. I looked, because I track these things, because why not? I've had 8 hours sleep 3 times since this year. I've had 7 hours sleep 14 times. So I woke up with 8 hours sleep. I edited this interview that you're about to hear while drinking some coffee, And now I'm doing an intro, and I'm just excited. Yeah, because Ken Miller was great. I hope you enjoy it. And come join the class this summer. It'll be a blast. But until then, remember, the greatest gift you can give someone, perhaps, is to share the brew. What brew? Oh, this episode. Do it. Peace. All right. Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and today we are with Kenneth R. Miller. He's the author of a whole bunch of books, likely your child's biology textbook, if you live in the United States of America, but also has a brand new book, The Human Instinct, How We Evolved to Have Reason, Consciousness, and Free Will. He also has a really cool book called Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul, and Darwin's God. So he likes writing, and surprisingly, as an academic, he both can write and is fun to talk to. Maybe one place to begin is for you to tell us a story about how you came to fall in love with the scientific quest and how that was connected to your Catholic upbringing.
Well, first of all, Trip, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I thank you for mentioning my popular books, although I do have to tell you, you mangled the title of the last one you mentioned. It's not Darwin's God, it's Finding Darwin's God.
Finding Darwin's God.
And the subtitle of that book will probably tell your viewers a fair amount about my approach. The subtitle is A Scientist's Search for Common Ground Between God and Evolution. Now, you asked for my own story, and, I'm tempted to say, how far back do you want me to go? I grew up in a sort of a gritty little urban town in New Jersey called Rahway, New Jersey. People from New Jersey know Rahway because it's where the state prison is. I always like to tell people I had an uncle who was a guard in the prison, and I have a high school classmate who is a permanent resident in the prison. So that tells you a little bit about what the town is like. I've been interested in science as far back as I can remember. I mean, I was the kind of kid who built things, took things apart, always wanted to know how things worked. In the summertime, I used to literally crawl on my hands and knees in the backyard of our house and sort of brush the blades of grass aside to look for ant nests and worms and all that other sort of stuff. And I always, like I said, seriously, I always knew I was interested in science. I could show your viewers a photograph of me on my 11th birthday, sitting in the basement of our house. And I had a little table, and on the table is my Gilbert chemistry set and my confirmation gift, which was a microscope. Sort of a toy microscope. I have a great big electron microscope now in my laboratory, but that was the interest I had in when I was a freshman in high school. I took my first dedicated course in biology. I had a wonderful, wonderful high school teacher. I still remember him. His name was Paul Zong. That's Zong with a Z. And his classroom was a mess. There were terraria, there were plants growing everywhere, there were lizards getting out of their cages. It was just amazing. He believed in hands-on biology. And I became convinced at that point that biology was the science with the greatest number of unanswered questions. Mm-hmm. And I had decided at that point that chemistry and physics had figured everything out that was interesting. I now know that's wrong. But it's clear that biology had so much to be discovered. And at that point, I decided I want to be a scientist. And Rahway, again, the town where I grew up, is also one of the main headquarters of Merck, the big pharmaceutical company. Mm-hmm. So I envisioned myself going to college, studying biology or biochemistry, and coming back home with a bachelor's degree and working at the bench and developing drugs and that sort of stuff. I got a scholarship to go to college at Brown University, which is actually where I teach now, mm-hmm. and got more and more interested in research. Did a research project with a couple of professors my last year and a half there. Realized that to be the sort of person who could walk into the lab and say, here's what we want to discover today. Earning a PhD was sort of like a union card. And I realized at that point, I got to go to grad school. And I discovered something. I didn't know it ahead of time. And many of your viewers may not know this either. But what I discovered is that graduate education in the sciences in the United States is free. Or it's better than free, you'll be paid for it. And that shocks people sometimes. But here's what I mean. If you were to look, for example, at any great state university, the Ohio State University, University of California, Texas A&M, Yale, Penn State, you would discover that the grad students in their PhD programs, all of them, are being supported by fellowships, by research assistantships, or by teaching assistantships, which means those students aren't paying anything for their education. They have to do research or teaching work along with it. But that basically meant that I could go to grad school, get a stipend, a monthly stipend to live on, and have no tuition costs. And I was floored by that. And the interesting thing is that's still true in this country. And I mention it because I always tell it to undergraduates and even to high school kids to encourage them, if they have the motivation, to go into experimental science. So I earned my PhD in cellular biology at the University of Colorado at Boulder. I was really lucky in grad school. Everything I touched seemed to work. It was great. So I published papers in big journals, and I jumped right from there to Harvard as an assistant professor. And I was at Harvard for 6 years until my undergrad alma mater, Brown, made me a very nice offer. And I love Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. I jumped at the chance to come back. Now, that's sort of my professional career, although I can tell you a little bit more about it. I work on biological membranes. My main research tool is that electron microscope that I mentioned, publish in scientific journals, compete for NIH and NSF research grants, and all that other sort of stuff. Now, what does all this have to do with faith or anything like that? Well, I was brought up in a Roman Catholic family, although it was kind of an interesting one. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. My dad grew up in southern Indiana in a very religious Catholic family. And at the time, Catholic families were always told that every good Catholic family should have at least one child in religious life, priest, brother, sister, and so forth. Well, my dad was the oldest. And he, after he graduated from high school, first in his class, I might add, he went off to St. Meinrad Seminary in southern Indiana to study to be a priest. And he lasted for almost 2 years until he decided, as he was to tell me later on, that he liked girls too much. And this was just not going to work. So he dropped out of the seminary, this is a true story, in December 1941. Guess what else happened in December 1941? Well, that was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So any uncertainty as to his future was quickly solved by a draft notice from the U.S. government. So he gets drafted into the Army. He was one of the lucky guys in World War II. He never heard a shot fired in anger. The Army sent him to a lot of technical schools. And towards the end of the war, he went to a country club dance, and he met this really pretty 17-year-old high school girl. 2 years later, 1946, when the war was over, they got married. That was my mom. Here's the twist. My mom was not Catholic. In the 1940s, no Catholic priest would marry someone outside the church. They were very tough about this then. So they were married by a Protestant minister. And my mom did not convert to Catholicism for 3 or 4 years. I was born a year and a half after the marriage. And then after they did, they were remarried by a priest. But they were remarried by a priest after I was born. So guess what that made me in the eyes of my dad's family back in Indiana? The answer is a child born out of wedlock. And for a while, they treated me that way. Our family wasn't very well off. My dad, as a result, we lived with my mother's parents. So we were brought up in my grandparents' house. They were not Catholic. They were wonderful people. They were not regular churchgoers. And my dad, who had spent his whole life in Catholic schools, had decided that his boys would not go to Catholic school. So we went to regular public schools, but we attended catechism, which are religious classes after school. I received the sacraments, was brought up as a good Catholic, contemplated the priesthood because I was seriously interested in the church. I even studied Latin to sort of get myself ready for it. But then decided my scientific vocation was much stronger. When I was in college, like a lot of people in college, I decided I was much too smart to believe in God. So I forgot all about that. But twice I realized that was a mistake and found my way back. We had a wonderful Catholic chaplain at the university where I went who was very understanding. This was the 60s. This was the anti-war movement, the hippie movement, all that other sort of stuff. And I have to tell you that one of the things that really brought me back to faith was even when I was in college studying biology as a Bachelor of Science major, I knew I wanted to write. And at the time, I wanted to write poetry. And I took a course in verse writing. I actually had a couple of poems published when I was in college. I hope nobody ever finds these poems. But our writing instructor had a little exercise. And the exercise was, in order to develop our ability to write poetry, he would each week give us 5 or 10 poems from a contemporary poet and ask us to write additional poems in that poet's style. Mm-hmm. So I was reading poems by Elizabeth Bishop and trying to write in her style, Robert Lowell, trying to write in his style. And one day he gave us some poems by a guy I'd never heard of, but I really liked the way he wrote. So I wrote some imitation poems in the style, and the professor called me up after class and said, "Ken, these are the best imitation poems you've ever written. Do you know who Thomas Merton is?" And you got to remember, man, this is the 60s. There's no internet. I can't Wikipedia him. Mm-hmm. There's nothing. And I said, "No, I have no idea." And he said, "Well, he's a Trappist monk." And my jaw dropped because the Trappists are a religious order within the church that take a vow of silence. And I was floored that somebody who had such beautiful control over language would enter an order where you do not speak. And I mean, it just blew me away. And I said, I got to find out some more about this Merton guy. So I went to a very, very large bookstore and I found a couple of his books of poems. But I also found that he had written a prose autobiography called The 7-Story Mountain. Mm-hmm. And I immediately snapped that up. Merton had gone to Columbia University in the 1940s, a very secular place. I was at Brown University in the 1960s, a very secular place, and was floored by the parallels between the struggles that Merton was going through and the thoughts I was having in my own everyday life. And one of the things that reading that book and thinking about Merton relieved me of was the notion that smart people don't believe in God. Mm-hmm. Because here was someone whose thoughts were profound, whose romance with the language was very, very deep, who grappled with the same questions I had and came out on the side of faith. And I have to tell you, ever since then, I've been a practicing Catholic. So that's the nature of sort of my own struggle. Now, I think it's fair to say, even though I did that and brought my children up in the faith, I don't think most people in my university, either Harvard or Brown, where I am now, would have known that I was a religious person. Probably not until 1981, which was my first year at Brown. And a group of students invited me to debate someone named Dr. Henry Morris, who was probably the country's foremost so-called scientific creationist. And he was the founder of the Institute for Creation Research in California. And they basically cajoled me into agreeing to debate him on the validity of the theory of evolution. And you may not believe this. The students sold tickets to this event. They sold them for about $1 a piece. And when they sold 200 tickets, they moved it to a lecture hall. When they sold 500, they had to move it to an auditorium. And they ended up selling more than 1,300 tickets. And as a result, the debate had to be held in the largest room on our campus, which is the ice hockey rink. And almost 3,000 people came. And, you got to realize I was, a young assistant professor. They weren't coming to hear me. And I don't think actually they're coming to hear Morris either. But here's what was going on in 81. 2 American states, Arkansas and Louisiana, had passed laws requiring the teaching of so-called creation science in the schools. And a lot of people wondered, is this really a new science? Is this going to become part of the biology curriculum? And that's what drew the crowd. And I realized I was up against a professional. And I literally dropped everything I was doing to set up my lab. And I studied and I worked and I read Dr. Morris's books, wrote letters to people, made slides. And the debate lasted more than 3 hours. And I was able to anticipate every one of his arguments, to answer every single one of them. And in the end, to win the debate. And I can tell you why I know that I won it, because Morris himself admitted that in an in-house newsletter. But here's the thing that floored me. One of the very first things that Morris did was to point out that I was defending an atheist point of view. And I was flabbergasted. And I said, well, a lot of my colleagues are not believers. That's fair. That's true. But, to the best of my ability, I'm a practicing Christian. I certainly don't see a conflict between my scientific work, between the theory of evolution and religious faith. And therefore, I reject the notion that to be a Christian, one must reject evolution. And I realized afterwards that was a point of view that not too many people had heard. So I ended up engaging in actually 4 more debates with Morris and other people, and always having to articulate the case for how a person of faith could possibly accept evolution. Finally, my literary agent, in the meantime, I had started to write a textbook with my good friend Joe Levine. And in the meantime, the literary agent who represented us with publishers knew of my activities talking about faith and science and the theory of evolution, said, Ken, you ought to write a book about this. And that book became Finding Darwin's God, which is the book that I held up a few minutes ago. And to this day, that book was published just about 20 years ago. But I know that it's used in college courses in science and religion all over the place. I get emails about it constantly. And I'm fairly well known, in fact, for taking the positions I do in that book, that faith and science are compatible. So if you like, that's sort of my personal scientific story and faith story.
No, I think it's really helpful and important to see, because having been a minister to a lot of professors, there's I think some cultural assumptions in the academy that don't actually bear out if you are the one they talk to. So, for example, like the harder the science, the higher the percentage of people that affirm an ultimate reality.
That's actually quite true. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So if you're hanging out with physicists, you're in a room full of Platonists and all sorts of things. You're the social scientists. They're in a room where the disciplines were invented by Marx and his interpreters. And and then if you're in the humanities, you just assume that almost all the scientists are like your friends that are evolutionary psychologists. And you haven't thought it, you haven't examined it, but there's this kind of cultural assumption that belief in God is odd. And I think part of it is that when they think of what science says about religion, the most popular voices are the angriest ones, and the ones that will, insist, trip, well, you're not even good at being Christian. I get that you might be ordained and are professionally studying your religious tradition's theology, but really your God's an angry one with a angry temper, very anthropomorphic, and all that kind of stuff. And I wonder how, what do you think the root is for those kind of cultural assumptions that individuals and our culture kind of share that assume there's a conflict that's not necessary?
Well, I think, as with politics, the loudest voices in the room tend to be the ones on the two extremes. So, for example, and I'll use politics for a second. If you listen to conservative Republicans. The Democrats are all socialists who want to abolish free enterprise, have the state provide everything, and so forth. And then if you listen to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, the conservatives are all a bunch of people who basically are racist and sexist and homophobic and want to have capitalist rule. In other words, they're all in favor of robber barons. In fact, I think, politically, most people agree on a certain set of assumptions that basically would enable us to build a society from that, current political divisions notwithstanding. But what you hear constantly is the people in what I would call the creationist camp are constantly citing writers like Richard Dawkins, bloggers like P.Z. Myers, and others who think that religious faith is the worst thing that's ever happened to human society. And they love to cite these people because of their personal overt hostility to religion. Then what happens is people on that side of what I would call scientific extremists say, look at these people over here. These idiots actually want to use scripture as a textbook on science. And whatever else scripture is, it's not a scientific recipe for how the world works. As Galileo's purported to have said, the purpose of scripture is not to tell us how heaven works, it's to help us get to heaven. And that's an important distinction. So you have two extremes that sort of validate the other side. The number of scientists who are actually people of faith is really quite surprising. It's not a majority, but it's a very substantial chunk, including an awful lot of members of the National Academy and quite a few Nobel laureates as well. And that's a point that I like to make. The other thing that I always enjoy pointing out, and I'm sorry, this is my parochial Catholicism speaking. Who is the founder of the modern science of genetics? Well, as every kid in every textbook learns, it's Father Gregor Mendel, a Roman Catholic priest. So you might say, well, that was the 19th century. To get educated, Father Mendel had to go to seminary. That's how he got education. There may be a little bit of truth in that, although Mendel actually remained a religious person his entire life. But here's another question. Who is the scientist who worked out the mathematical foundations of cosmic expansion, which is what we now call the Big Bang? Who is the intellectual father of the Big Bang? And a lot of people, if you just ask them that, will say, it's probably Einstein, or maybe it's Hubble, who first noticed the redshift in distant galaxies and so forth. Well, the answer is neither of those. It's actually Father Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian priest and a professor of mathematics and physics at the University of Louvain in Belgium. And Georges Lemaitre is now known widely as the father of the Big Bang because he's the person who used Einstein's equations of general relativity to prove that the universe could not be static. It had to be expanded. And that means it's bigger. It will be bigger tomorrow than it is today. But it also means it was smaller yesterday and even smaller a week ago. And infinitely, if we regress into the past, that means the universe had an origin from a single cosmic point. And that's what today we popularly call the Big Bang. And many people throughout his life, Lemaitre lived well into the 1960s. Many people would ask Father Lemaitre, the Big Bang, that's not in the book of Genesis. How can you remain a religious person? And his answer was, the story in Genesis is a theological story of the relationship between the Creator and his creation. It is not a textbook of cosmology. And God gave us our intellects to understand how the universe works. And therefore, in doing the work that he did, he was actually engaging in a kind of prayerful activity to understand the creation of the Lord. And I think that's an entirely appropriate attitude for Christians and other people of faith to have towards science.
Yeah, and it's not new is the thing I think that's important to point out, right? Like Augustine, when he wrote on the literal interpretation of Genesis, says, now, if you're explaining this to someone and they actually think God made it in 6 24-hour days, which is weird, like don't ruin their faith or something, but like that's not what this text is about. And then like Aquinas, postulates multiple different ways the universe could have come into being, and that the universe has always been there. And it's an eternal universe, because that's not what we mean when we say God is creator.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I can assure your viewers that if Augustine or Aquinas were walking around today, they'd be evolutionists. And all you have to do is to read that book by Augustine you mentioned, On the Literal Meaning of Genesis, where he emphasizes that we can obtain truth through our senses, and meaning through scientific empirical means. And if the truth that we are able to perceive seems to contradict the meaning of Scripture, it's time to reinterpret Scripture. And Augustine was quite clear about that. Aquinas was extremely clear in saying, look, God gave us two gifts, and those gifts are faith and reason. And faith and reason should always be compatible with each other. And since science is the child of reason, that's certainly something that I agree with.
Yeah, and when I've been out speaking, especially in areas with more conservative people present, and I say something about faith and reason being connected, and you get from very conservative evangelicals who their threat of the veracity of their faith is what they're defending, and you want to go like, yeah, I believe you've encountered God in the tradition. I just don't think that disappears the moment you recognize truth elsewhere, right? And I used this as an example once, and I at least got a nod, was that not having faith in the experiential center of religion and making it just about reason's boring, and one without the other it can end up being a bad idea. It's like letting your 19-year-old kid go get married because they said they really feel really in love and haven't thought through the fact and reason whether or not the relationship's good. Like they actually work better together.
Well, I might take exception to that example, since my mom was married when she was 19.
Well, that was a reasonably good one. Look at the fruits. You judge things by their fruit.
Worked out okay.
You're an educator, a softball coach.
No. I was a coach when my girls were little. I am now an NCAA fast pitch softball umpire. So I umpire intercollegiate softball. And in fact, I should tell you, I've been in a fair number of debates on this issue with people, and every now and then people will come up to me afterwards and say, how do you manage to maintain your cool when all these people are saying these things? And I said, man, do you have any idea what people say to an umpire during a ball game? And if I can keep my cool then a debate is no problem at all.
Oh, that is so true. I played pitcher and catcher, and when you're good enough at baseball until your fastball stops getting faster, you kind of do either one. And I was in a tournament, and I caught the second game, and the game before they left down and in wide open, and I hit it over and over for strikes. And then the other pitcher's sitting there hitting the same spot again, ball, and I'm like, and I looked at him, I'm like, I go, you've been calling that a strike all day. He said, it's what it is when I say what it is, and that's how it is.
Well, that's sort of an arrogant thing for an umpire to say. But and I will tell you, I was a catcher too when I played baseball, and one of the first things the attitude you want to bring with you to the game is you want to work with the umpire. You want to give a good view of the plate, and I always respect catchers. And I can't tell you how many times, I'll start off a game, I'm down there in the crouch, first pitch comes in, I go ball, and the catcher will whisper to me, how much that missed by? And I say about 2 inches, bring it in 2 inches. And she'll say, okay, and the next kid, here comes a pitch, ball. She'll say, is that a little closer? Yeah, I said, I need 1 more inch. Give me that inch. This is a pitcher with really good control, of course. And then they'll set up a little more inside, and it goes, and then they're very happy. It's very difficult. We're getting off topic here, but it's very, very difficult to be consistent in calling where a moving object flies through an entirely hypothetical 3-dimensional space and get it right every time. But what makes a really good umpire is accuracy in seeing the corners and consistency, and that's what you work for. And when an umpire is not being consistent, it's not because they want to be inconsistent. It's because this is a human activity, and it's tough to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that not getting sidetracked about baseball, which is really easy to do. Is it one of the things that popped out in the in your work is the ingenuity of creation scientists becoming intelligent designers and things. Like my family were Baptists growing up, but we were liberal Baptists, so you always liked science, and I didn't have that existential dread of and the whole like flagellum explanation.
The bacterial flagellum.
Oh yeah, they I mean, obviously there's a creator, or the blood clotting thing. I remember being told if you carbon date a live mollusk, they're millions of years old, but they're alive, and I'm like, that seems so odd. But like in your experience in doing the history of the intelligent design movement and things, what do you think the motivating force is for it?
Well, I think there actually are a number of motivating forces. One is obviously, if you're someone who is a biblical literalist, who basically believes as a matter of faith, the earth is about 6,000 years old. We are all descended from a single created pair named Adam and Eve, and all of the events in Scripture are literal events. Then you want to rescue that at all costs because it depends on your entire understanding of the Bible. Now, I'm no theologian, but I've heard people say, well, if the Bible is not true in its first book, meaning Genesis, how could it possibly be true in its later books, meaning the Gospels and the letters of Paul? And I think that betrays a misunderstanding of what the Bible is. The Bible is not a book. The Bible is a library. It's a collection of different books written at different times by different people for different purposes. And anyone who studies, even in a cursory way, the history of Christianity knows that in the 3rd and 4th century, there was no such thing as the Bible. Instead, there were a collection of books. And then there was an attempt made at the Council of Nicaea to decide which books should be codified and put together and which ones should be rejected. Now, we hope that the people who made those decisions chose wisely. But the fact of the matter is, these books did not come to us in a pillar of flame saying, here is the Bible. And some of these books are legitimate histories. The Book of Kings, for example, they recite actual battles, actual historical events, and so forth. The Psalms are a series of religious poems. The Song of Solomon is a love poem. And if you read the Song of Solomon, sometimes called the Canticle of Canticles, it's actually a pretty sexy poem at that. When my wife and I got married, the priest, it was his first wedding, by the way, he was a neophyte, gave us the opportunity to pick out the scripture readings. And my wife, who's an artist, picked out some extremely graphic passages from the Song of Solomon. And when these were read during the nuptial mass, my own families, my dad's family from Indiana, these conservative Southern Indiana Catholics, figured it was some sort of a hippie thing because there were naked breasts and passion and all this other sort of stuff. They said, "Where'd you get that stuff?" And I said, "It's from the Bible. Look it up." And then you have the Book of Genesis. And again, I'm not a biblical scholar, but the scholarship that I'm aware of indicates that the Book of Genesis was not written at the beginning of time, of course. It was written probably during the Babylonian captivity. And it was written to sort of contrast the Hebrew conception of God from that of their Babylonian captors. Mm-hmm. And the Babylonians had a similar story. It has a talking snake, it's got a fruit tree and everything, called the myth of Gilgamesh. And the Babylonians viewed creation as being the product of a clash between gods that were good and gods that were evil. And that accounts for the persistence of evil in the world. The Hebrews, of course, were monotheists. There was a single God. And by definition, his creation had to be all good. Where does evil come from? Evil comes from mankind's willing rejection of God's plan. And that's the message that's in the Book of Genesis. So to look at that as cosmic or geological history is a misreading of why that book was written in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, so many times biblical literalism actually keeps you from benefiting most deeply from the religious tradition you value.
Yeah, indeed. I've had conversations with people who said, "Well, you have to be literalist," and I'm fond of quoting a psalm that says, "O Lord, thou art my rock, my strength." And I said, "Now you're a literalist, okay? What kind of rock is God? Is he igneous, sedimentary, or metamorphic?" And they'll look at me saying, "Hey, you're being a pain in the butt." And the answer is, of course I am. But what you're admitting to me, even though you claim to be a literalist, is that certain passages in the Bible are indeed meant allegorically or metaphorically. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what that passage about God being my rock and my strength means. You're comparing God to the constancy of the rock. And therefore, much of the Bible is written in poetry like that.
Yeah, and Jesus was a storyteller. And no one stops reading The Prodigal Son when they're like, now, as a historian verified there were two sons, and one of them, the truth is not deterred by its historical veracity.
Yeah, and actually, I should tell you something, which is as an educator, as a college professor who teaches not just courses in my specialty, which is cell and molecular biology, but intro bio as well. All good teachers teach by telling stories. And Jesus was a master teacher. And you see that very clearly in the parables.
So one of the things that I was struck by in Only a Theory was the way in which, and you can maybe just tell the story about how they literally took a creation book and edited the words because, that's about as revelatory as it gets. And it doesn't get past the professor because that type of cutting and pasting is inherently problematic.
The argument that was made for intelligent design and for its presence in our schools was that it's entirely a secular idea, that living organisms show evidence of design, and that doesn't depend on religious faith, and therefore it's entirely appropriate to include this in a biology curriculum. And in fact, in the year 2004, the school board of a town called Dover, Pennsylvania, actually instructed the biology teachers in Dover area high school to prepare a curriculum on intelligent design. Mm-hmm. And they purchased two classroom sets of an intelligent design textbook called Of Pandas and People. The school board's action led to a lawsuit by 11 parents who filed a lawsuit in federal court in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, arguing that intelligent design was inherently religious and therefore using the science classroom to advance a particular interpretation of religion violated the First Amendment's clause against having an agency of the state, and that's what a school board is, establish a religion. Well, the trial that resulted from that is known as Kitzmiller versus Dover. The 11th plaintiffs included Tammy Kitzmiller. So why it's called that? And I was asked to be the lead witness for the plaintiffs in that trial. And I actually spent the first 2 days of the trial on the stand. And I'm, proud of the testimony I gave. I think I set the stage for the case we wanted to make. But the key person among our 5 expert witnesses, the plaintiffs in that trial, wasn't me. And it wasn't a theologian named John Haught. It wasn't Kevin Padian, a paleontologist. All of them were really effective witnesses. The key person was a philosophy professor from Louisiana named Barbara Forrest. And Barbara was given the job of taking this book, Pandas and People, and looking into the history of its publication. And we executed what lawyers will understand as a discovery motion to the publisher. And the publisher was required to produce draft copies of this textbook going back for years before it was published. And it turns out that this textbook on intelligent design, which doesn't have a word about God, the book of Genesis, or creation in it anywhere, originally was written as a textbook about creation. And it mentioned the creator and the created aspects of organisms and everything else. And what Barbara discovered is that at a certain stage in the editing, and this actually followed a Supreme Court decision, the publisher must have realized that if we use the word creator in this book, it will be kicked out as being religious. So I want your viewers to think about this. So basically what they did was they fired up Microsoft Word and they did a find and replace where they took the word creator and replaced it with the word designer. Ooh. So that the book read paragraph per paragraph, line for line, except creator was replaced by designer. Barbara showed this brilliantly during her testimony. This was the key in the trial. But there was even a better one, which is basically there was a statement in the original book which said creation proponents view the fossil record this way or something like that. During the find and replace, and anyone who's ever done a find and replace knows that you have to be real careful because sometimes you have unexpected changes in there. Mm-hmm. Well, they weren't that careful in the manuscript. And there was one of these fossils of a careless find and replace. And it read, see design proponentists. So you could actually see that they had changed creation proponentists and they had stuck the word designer right in there. So it was a very crude attempt to mask the identity of the designer. And it was very clear to the judge, once Barbara presented her testimony, that what was behind this was an intentional effort to deceive people as to the religious nature of the entire intelligent design argument. The judge is a strict constructionist. He's a conservative Republican. He was appointed to the bench by President George W. Bush. You might have thought he'd be on the side. And he's also a Methodist, regular churchgoer. But he knew an attempt to deceive when he saw one. And as soon as it was clear that this book was actually an attempt to disguise the religious origins of this idea, I think we have the case won at that point. And I say mazel tov to my good friend Barbara Forrest for doing exactly that.
Yeah. So when I think of a number of the different elements or maybe places of resistance that people bring up, you have the whole missing link thing, and you kind of show that there's not a missing link. But the part that struck me as immediately problematic, if I thought about holding to intelligent design, is the story of our fused chromosomes. Can you share that? Because I think literally, like, if I was a minister or an educator as a person of faith and want to let the people I'm leading understand not only is this not a threat to our faith, but is in fact like about as proved gets. There's more evidence that we are descendants of apes or primates, that we're primates and have this whole evolutionary heritage than there is that Caesar was left-handed. And
there you go. Okay,
you know what I mean?
So I'll try to explain this. And I mentioned it, of course, in the book Only a Theory, but we now have much better data that confirm this. And in my latest book, The Human Instinct, I mentioned this. And I went into such detail that I thought it was necessary to include a technical appendix called the chromosome 2 fusion site. So here's basically the basis of this. And I hope I hope my hand is steady enough to hold this up. What you see here are chromosome diagrams that appeared in a scientific paper published, I believe, let me double check. Actually, I don't have it on this page. But I believe this was published in the late 1960s or early 1970s. And what you see here are chromosome 1, chromosome 2, chromosome 3, and chromosome 4 from 4 different species. And those species are us, Homo sapiens, gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans. And you can see there's a banding pattern in each of those chromosomes. Well, there are 2 shockers here. When you compare our chromosomes and our banding pattern to these other 3 great apes, the bands line up almost perfectly. However, and here's the interesting thing, We human beings have 46 chromosomes. Each of us got 23 from mom and 23 from dad. However, all the other great apes, gorillas, orangs, chimps, they have 48, which means a baby chimp gets 24 from mom and 24 from dad. So are we missing a pair of chromosomes? Is that why we only have 23 pairs instead of 24? Well, any geneticist would tell you that the loss of both members of what biologists call a homologous pair of chromosomes would be fatal. You wouldn't be able to get through embryonic development. So the only explanation that makes sense is that two chromosomes, which are still separate in the other primates, somehow got stuck together to form a single fused chromosome in us. Now, if that happened, and that's the only explanation that's consistent with common descent, we should be able to look at the genomes of these three other primates and find two chromosomes that are still separate in them, but are fused together in us. And I'll hold this back up again, and you might notice right here that there are indeed chromosomes that are separate in the other three species, but are fused together in us, and the banding pattern lines up. Those chromosomes used to be called 12 and 13, number 12 and number 13 in those other primates. We don't call them that, meaning molecular biologists no longer call them 12 and 13. We call them 2A and 2B. And that's because they correspond to the two halves of our chromosome. And with DNA sequencing, it gets even better. And that is, and this will probably not show up, even though I'm going to wave it at the screen. We can actually look now at the DNA base sequence, the A's, T's, G's, and C's, and we can see the exact site, sort of the Scotch tape, holding these two pieces of the chromosome together. And what this shows, and this is important because being a writer, I pay a lot of attention to wording. What this shows is not that we are descended from apes, but what it shows is that we share a common ancestor with the other great apes. And that common ancestor lived anywhere from 6 to 10 million years ago, depending on whether you're talking about gorillas, orangs, and chimpanzees. And DNA sequences are not hypotheses. They are not theories. DNA sequences are facts. And there is literally no other way to explain the DNA sequence of human chromosome number 2 other than sharing common ancestry with these other organisms. And that's the important point to make.
Yeah, so I think that's really important, and it leads to a question that I have been asked multiple times from people once they start realizing. And there's a lot of reasons. Once they realize that we're actually a part of nature, right? Like, I think the Enlightenment made humans think that we're even more a center of the universe than medieval Europe told us, and that we are a mind, and then the rest of nature's a machine, and it works that way, and that's all well and good, and it's material stuff, but we got the goods. And then science comes around and puts us back in nature, and so now, our fear is, we're just a machine. Right. Now there's nothing unique about us humans. And I think that's why the questions in the human instinct are really important. Like, do we even have any freedom? Like, do we have a reason? Like, what's human consciousness? Is that an epiphenomena? And things. So when you encounter that anxiety that comes up with someone that's like, junk, Ken just did it. You got fused chromosomes. I guess I'm going to have to admit this is reality. What's the beginning place for talking about what and who, or what it means to be a human?
Well, that's exactly why I wrote this book, The Human Instinct. And I started off by pointing out the sort of grim pronouncements you hear from many people of my profession, from many people in science, who say, well, we're just another animal. We're no more special than any other creature on the face of the earth. The blogger P.Z. Myers said human beings are no more special to the universe than a sea slug is. Well, being a biologist, I happen to think that sea slugs are actually quite remarkable creatures. But in terms of specialness, there's something different about human beings. And I say this more as a scientist, actually, than as a person of faith. And the way in which I tried to sum up the arguments I made in this book is in the last chapter. And the last chapter is entitled Center Stage. And I don't know how other people write, but I do know that when I'm beginning a chapter on a new topic, I agonize over how to start that chapter. In other words, what's the right way, the right approach to take it? And if I can find the right approach, then the rest of it just flows, and I can write quite quickly. Well, I'm agonizing, and this is the summer 2 years ago. It's August. And I'm agonizing, how do I start this chapter? Because I want to say that the scientific story itself tells us that human beings are special, unique, and important, endowed with free will, endowed with genuine cognition, that the human species matter. How do I start that? And I realized I'm sitting in my backyard in Massachusetts where we live. And I realized, oh my goodness, tonight is going to be the Perseid meteor shower. And even though I'm a biologist, I've always been a nut about astronomy. My wife and I, for example, I dragged her along, I have to say. My wife and I last summer made arrangements years in advance to be in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, during the total solar eclipse that happened in August 2017. And I picked that because the eclipse goes right down the middle of Main Street in Jackson, and also, given the weather that's there, it was quite likely to be clear, which it was. And oh, God, did we have a good time. My girls would tell you that when they were little, and there was a night when we had a lunar eclipse or a meteor shower, I used to wake them up at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning and drag them into the yard to see these phenomena. And I did it more than once in the meteor shower with the Perseids. And I began to think about that because I already put a lounge chair out in the yard. So at 3 a.m., I could spray myself with mosquito repellent, go out there, lie back on the lounge chair, and enjoy the meteor shower. And I thought about it. I said, this is how I start the chapter. And I started out by saying, I'm hoping for a clear night tonight, because tonight is the Perseid meteor shower. And I will lie out in my backyard looking for these streaks of fire in the heavens. And I won't be alone doing this. There'll be other people. There'll be tens of thousands of them scattered all over the world, different languages, different cultures, different places, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Perseids. Of all the creatures on this planet, of all the marvelous forms of life, there is only one that knows the Perseids are coming. There's only one that's planning to look up at the sky tonight. And there's only one that takes delight in this phenomenon. That's us. And that's one of the things, one of the marks of the specialness of human nature. The late Carl Sagan, not a believer, of course, but someone whose view of the specialness of human nature was almost religious, liked to say that we human beings, we are part of the cosmos. You mentioned part of nature. We certainly are. And we are made up of matter. We're made up of matter that was forged in the fires of stars. So he loved to say that we are literally made up of stardust. But we are the part of the cosmos that has become aware of itself. So that in the emergence of human beings on planet Earth, what has happened is that the cosmos, for the first time that we know of, has become self-aware, has woken up, and is taking stock in itself. So we human beings, our species, we are the conscious part of the cosmos that has discovered science and has become self-aware. That alone tells us how special human beings are. And from that awareness, which I think all people should be able to understand and share, whether they are religious or not, from that self-awareness of the importance of the human species comes a truly religious and faith-based way of looking at our importance in the project of existence.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's I think ending the book that way worked really well. I think it actually makes your ending contrast with Sam Harris' ending of his book.
Oh, my.
Really, really clear. And you kind of talk about it in the book, where he's like discussing with himself how he's going to end the book, and whether he's freely choosing to go, because he's doesn't think he is.
Yeah, and for your viewers who don't quite know what we're talking about, Sam Harris, the atheist writer, author of Letter to a Christian Nation and other things, recently wrote a very short book on free will, which he claims we simply do not have. Now, Harris is now a qualified neuroscientist, and he makes a very good argument. He's a very good writer, makes a compelling argument that basically our minds are entirely physically based. We are based in matter. I agree with that. I think personally, there's nothing that happens up here that is not explicable in terms of the laws of physics and chemistry and the cell biology of neural connections in the brain. So I share that belief with Harris. But Harris argues that means we simply don't have free will. We are programmed. We are steered by events outside, and the notion of the self therefore is invalid. We're just carrying out a series of chemical reactions that give us the illusion of free will. But then as he gets to end the book, he has to answer, he realizes a very interesting question, which if he doesn't have free will either, and we don't have free will in deciding whether or not to accept his arguments, how does he explain that now it's time to end this book? Has he made a judgment? In other words, oh my God, has he exercised his own free will to say this will be the concluding page of the book? And this gets him into all sorts of little torturous recipes. And he basically says, I think I'm going to have something to eat, so the book is over. And again, he has to abrogate the very idea that he is free to make these arguments. And I remember many years ago, not that many, less than 10, I was asked to speak at an event at the New York Academy of Science devoted to the life of British scientist and novelist C.P. Snow, the author of a great book called The Two Cultures. I'd recommend to anyone. And I gave a talk on C.P. Snow, and there was a break, and there was another session. And my friend, privileged to call him my friend, E.O. Wilson, the great writer on natural history and evolution from Harvard, got up and gave a brief talk. And in that talk, Ed basically echoed Harris's arguments that we don't have free will. We should get over the idea of free will. It's destructive to us and so forth. Then when he finished his very brief talk, he was asked, Dr. Wilson, what do you think is the most important scientific point that you would like to make to the general public? Now, Ed is very big on species conservation, the conservation of biodiversity. I am too. And he said it was very important for people to understand the importance of biodiversity to our survival on this planet, to conserve species, to conserve wild habitat, to limit our impact on the environment. He made a passionate plea for this. And it struck me as very strange that one moment he was arguing we have no free will to decide anything. And then he was making an argument to his listeners, who presumably don't have free will, that they should come to the conclusion, but of course they can't come to conclusion because they have no free will, to conserve biodiversity. So the contrast between arguing against free will and then making a passionate argument that people should come to a certain conclusion struck me as particularly ironic. All of science, free will, I think, is a philosophical imperative, if only because the integrity of science itself depends on us having the free will to devise experiments, evaluate data, and construct theories. And if we don't have the free will to do that, then science itself is pre-programmed and therefore is not science at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. And so one of the things that stuck out in the human instinct was, and you mentioned it earlier that you were friends with Stephen Gould, and then you bring up E.O. Wilson. So I wonder how you would contrast the NOMA model and the consilience model with your own understanding of the relationship between religion and science, because one of the elements I loved about the human instinct is that it's like there are things up for grabs when you're wrestling with science. That if you get to if the best account of being a human is one where consciousness is pure epiphenomena, does nothing, we have no will, reason's a determined fabrication and things, then like that should have an impact on our religious commitments. Like you can't separate them all. But also you are describing humanity where this is the best, richest, most full description of humanity you can as a scientist, but that doesn't close off our description of humanity. It doesn't explain away human phenomena completely.
Yeah, no, so I'll start with E.O. Wilson first in Consilience. In Consilience, and actually in an earlier book called On Human Nature, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize, Wilson explains religion in an evolutionary sense. And he basically admits that all human beings have what he calls a religious impulse. And he defines it as a tendency to coalesce around symbolism, myth, and ritual. Mm-hmm. And he points out that all societies have what can be recognized as religious rituals. And he liked to say that even the old Soviets in the days of communism had clearly religious events and religious ceremonies. Think of the May Day celebration, the veneration of Lenin's tomb, the deification of the hammer and sickle symbol. He says all of these basically can be understood in a religious way. And his argument is that the reason we have the religious impulse is because early groups of humans who were better able to coalesce around something that today we would say was religious formed more coherent societies, more coherent tribes, if you will, or groupings, and were better able to do the things that made those groupings successful, such as raise food, make babies, and make war on their neighbors. Mm-hmm. And all of these things are things that human societies are very good at. So you know what? To some extent, I agree with that. I think the religious impulse can be understood partially as a response to evolutionary pressures. But if you explain the religious impulse, does that also explain away religion? And the point that I always like to make is you can also use the same argument to explain why we have this scientific impulse, which is an impulse to look for the causes that underlie natural phenomena, to use experiment, to develop theories, and so forth. But in explaining how evolution gave us the scientific impulse, have you also explained science away? And the answer is no. And you certainly haven't explained religion away or religious faith away either. Now, Ed is more an acquaintance than a friend, but the late Stephen Jay Gould, I was privileged to count as a friend. I was the junior faculty at Harvard when he was there. We actually served on a committee together. We were drawn together by a mutual love of baseball. And Steve actually corresponded with me when I was preparing my very first debate against the scientific creationist, which he advised me, by the way, not to do. But after the debate was over, he said, well, you shouldn't have done it, but as long as you went ahead and did it, it was important to win. And obviously you won these debates. And I hosted Steve many times at Brown. Steve, at one point, if you read his columns in Natural History magazine, you'll see there's a distinct hostility to religion in many of those early columns. But in 82 or 83, suddenly that mellows. And I don't know if this is the formative event, but I hosted Steve for a seminar at Brown in 1982. And he showed up in my office with a camera crew because he had just been named the Scientist of the Year by Discover magazine. So we had a nice chat in my office. There's a picture of us in Discover, the two of us chatting together. I had a lot more hair then and a big beard and everything else. And Steve, when we were chatting, pulled out of his briefcase the most beautiful envelope I have ever seen in my life, which was a parchment envelope with a yellow and white ribbon around it. And it was an invitation from the Pontifical Academy of Sciences to come to Rome and attend a meeting on human evolution. And Steve asked me, he said, Ken, I think you're Catholic, right? I said, yeah. And he says, does the Pope know that I'm a Jewish agnostic from Brooklyn? And my answer to that was, Steve, the Pope knows everything, which set him back for a second. But the point here, and I explained to him, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences is a group of very, very eminent scientists, Nobel Prize winners and everything, who are not necessarily religious, but they will meet to advise the Vatican on matters of science. So he went to this meeting, and I think it was the first time in his life that he palled around, hung out with a lot of people whom he could respect as scientists, but were also mostly religious people. And I think that got him to thinking. And a few years later, a book came out called Rocks of Ages. And that's where the idea of NOMA that you referred to, non-overlapping magisteria, came about. He basically said, look, science and religion can get along just fine if science stays over here on its side of the fence and realizes it's an empirical discipline that tells us how nature works, but doesn't tell us why we exist or provide moral guidance or anything else. And then religion over here, that'll get along just fine on its side of the fence, as long as it doesn't tell the scientists over there what they have to discover. That's a nice recipe for peace, but I think, as the British say, NOMA is too clever by half. And what I mean by that is to pretend that our understanding of science does not affect our religious view of the world is completely wrong. And you can see that when you try to understand the story of human evolution. And to pretend that religion, which is involved in the formation of ethical values, should not affect how we do science, I think is naive as well. So Steve's formulation, I think, was just a little bit too cute.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions that I wondered most about after reading the book was your engagement with philosophers of mind, and in talking about Nagel and Strawson and such. And I wonder if the theory of mind, like that you're hinting at, because you kind of close off a number of avenues, or maybe you can introduce how you understand mind and consciousness. But my thought was that you're arguing for some type of strong form of emergence of mind, where
I think that's fair.
Where there is a top-down causality that happens at mind, which is necessary in your argument for reason and for a type of non-libertine freedom, but also that the constituent blocks that facilitate the emergence of consciousness, which is not something separate from the material existence that's there. How do you think? Like, if you weren't doing the chapter organized by your engagement with contemporary theorists, how would you structure it? Or how would you, you were just like, tell me what you think about mind and consciousness, would you frame it?
Well, to sort of put this in context for your viewers, Thomas Nagel is one of the world's most famous philosophers. Mm-hmm. And he's been posing a really sticky problem for a long time. And if any of your viewers are interested in it, Google the following article: "What is it like to be a bat?" It's all over the internet. It's like 5 pages long. It's a very easy read. But in it, Nagel asks us to do the thought experiment and to recognize that bats can move in total darkness by echolocation. So for them, the world is defined by sounds of various frequencies and pitches that come back to them as they echolocate. Now, I would point out that human beings can do a primitive form of echolocation too. And I won't go into how I know that or my own experiences with it. But I think Nagel makes a good point, which is we can scientifically define how a bat echolocates in terms of chirps and frequencies and bouncing back. But none of that scientific explanation explains what it's like to be a bat and have the brain of a bat and actually echolocate as we zoom through a cave or a darkened room and stuff like that. Now, much more recently, he's published a book called Mind and Cosmos. And it was the subtitle of Mind and Cosmos that first caught my eye, which is why the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is almost certainly wrong. And I thought, really? Really? So naturally, I bought the book. It's like 128 pages long. But you have to appreciate the fact it's 128 pages written by a philosopher. You got to read it very slow. You got to work your way through it. And Nagel makes the following argument. You'll see his beef is not with evolution so much as it is with neuroscience. Mm-hmm. And he basically argues that neuroscience can explore the brain, can study the impulses that move around the brain, can explore how our sensory systems work and this sort of stuff. But it cannot account for what Galen Strawson, whom you also referred to, calls the hard problem of consciousness, which is right now in your mind and mine and anyone watching us. There is an interpersonal experience taking place. I'm sitting in a room. I can see the screen. Over here, though, there's a window outside. I'm conscious of that. I hear some ambient sounds in the room. I have a sense of, what I just ate for lunch, whether I'm hungry or thirsty, what I'm thinking about besides what I'm saying to you. You're doing exactly the same thing. You might be thinking of your next question. Where does that inner experience, which is unique to you, come from? And he argues that neuroscience can explain literally everything that might happen in the brain, but it still can't answer where the inner subjective experience of consciousness comes from, any more than we can know what it is like to be a bat. Now, what does this have to do with evolution? He argues that the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, which is based in a materialism, which is also the base of neuroscience, purports to be able to eventually explain everything. And since neuroscientists can't really explain the inner experience, the feel of consciousness, it means that ultimately neo-Darwinian evolution can't explain it either. And that's the problem. Now, Nagel, to be fair, is an atheist. He is not making an argument for God. He's making an argument for the notion that there are some things beyond materialism that science cannot approach. Now, I thought about that for a very long time. I actually wrote a review of Nagel's book for the Catholic intellectual journal Commonweal, and basically argued that he's fundamentally wrong, because what he's done is to take the fact that there are certain things that science has not yet explained about the workings of the human mind, and from that he's concluded that we never will understand them. I think that's incorrect. The analogy I made was in 1944, the great physicist Erwin Schrödinger wrote a book called What is Life? And in that book, he argued that the physics and chemistry of the time, of the 1940s, was not sufficient to explain how genetics work, couldn't explain the nature of the gene. And he actually wrote that new laws of physics and chemistry will be required, new laws of physics and chemistry, to explain how genetics works. Well, he was wrong about that, because he was about a decade away from the development of the double helix model of DNA structure by Watson and Crick and Franklin. And there is no new chemistry in the DNA double helix. There's no new physics. What there is a molecule that just opens our eyes to how the existing laws of physics and chemistry can be used to produce a self-replicating molecule that can encode within it the properties of the gene. I would argue, and I argued in my review, and I tried to argue in my book, The Human Instinct, that ultimately those very same laws of physics and chemistry are going to be able to explain how neural systems can produce consciousness. We're not there yet, but I think it's scientifically invalid and foolish, actually, to throw up our hands and say, because we cannot understand the subjective experience, the inner experience of consciousness, we never will. That betrays, I think, a false sense of how science eventually solves even the most insoluble of problems. So I think Nagel is wrong about that. Where does our consciousness come from? I believe it comes from the matter of which we are made and the enormously complex cellular biology of connections within the brain, which are so complex that we cannot even come close to modeling them at this point. Is it somehow demeaning or a denial of our divine nature to say that our thoughts are based in mere matter and energy? I don't think so. I'm always fond of a little statement that C.S. Lewis put into the book Mere Christianity, which is, God likes matter, he invented it. And we are creatures of matter. Scripture tells us we are made of dust, and to dust thou shalt return. I don't see anything that contradicts either human uniqueness or religious faith to say that we are indeed creatures of matter. We will indeed return to the material world. But that matter is arranged in such a way that it accounts for human consciousness and ultimately human reason. Now, I have been criticized by my own scientific friends who are also people of faith for saying that, and one of them told me, I have conceded too much to what he called the physicalists. In other words, I've emphasized too much that human nature is physical in nature. I think I have conceded a lot to the notion that we are physical in nature, but the very physical universe, if you're a person of faith, is a creation of God. And therefore, the notion that our humanity is based in that matter and energy, if God is the reason for matter and energy, I don't see a contradiction of the divine in that at all.
Well, I can guess what the concerns of physicalism would pop up. I mean, a lot of it, I think, is how someone hears the word when someone says matter, right?
Yeah.
Like you flip back to energy or matter and energy. And one of the debates, one of the debates around that is that, matter has a lot is in a sense, the external expression of energy, right? And like and science engages in, it has encounters with things that are objectified in some sense, right? And like some type of mapping of our brain, even if you can understand all the correlates and map it out, doesn't lead to occupying what it's like to be you in the conversation, even if you could make correlations of what it was like to be you. It doesn't give the interiority. Does that make sense? Like, I wonder if sometimes...
I think it does. And the analogy that I like to use, because I'm a cell biologist, is my entire field is predicated on the notion that everything that happens inside a living cell is based on protein structure, lipid organization, molecular interactions, and chemical reactions. Life is chemical and physical. I see no reason to argue with that. But having said that, it's very difficult to say at what point a collection of molecules inside a membrane actually becomes alive. And that's just at the level of the single cell, let alone the 70 billion cells that are in the human brain. So, as complexity increases, and you use the word emergence, as complexity increases, the complexity of emergent properties goes up as well. And one of the analogies I made is, you can take the works of Shakespeare and you can say that all of Shakespeare is explicable in terms of 26 alphabetical symbols, a few punctuation marks, and a lot of spaces. You can have a complete description, for example, of every character, the letter A, the letter Y, a space, a comma, a semicolon, that's in the play Hamlet. And you wouldn't understand Hamlet from that. Hamlet, nonetheless, is based in those 26 plus a few other symbols. And that's where the drama and the humanity of that play comes out. There is a higher level of understanding that emerges when you put those symbols together and then you interpret them. And I think something analogous is happening in the human brain when you put those neurons and nerve impulses together in terms of how they interact and how they produce higher level function.
When you think of like the whole the cosmic story all the way to in the emergence of humanity and our ability to like make eye contact while you make love, have fun at a sporting event and all that kind of stuff, I like, when did telling that story become a sacred one to you? Because that to me is something that's shocking, how few people don't realize that if you are a person of faith, God has been invested in this creation for over 13 billion years. Just have these intense experiences that weren't there without this big process of.
I'm going to retreat to one of the words of Albert Einstein. And Einstein once wrote that there's only two ways to believe, and that is that nothing is a miracle or that everything is a miracle. And I believe the latter.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that's where the magic, that's where the fire and the equations come from.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for hanging out on the internet, talking, and being such a great writer as well.
Oh, Trip, that's awful kind of you to say, and I've really enjoyed this. And anytime you like, I'd be happy to do it again. Thank you.
Oh, definitely.